They called him a mistake. She called him her miracle. In a town that whispered hate, her baby's skin told a story they tried to bury until a stranger with fire in his eyes rode in and claimed the child with a word that changed everything. Son. The baby didn't cry when he was born. He just stared eyes wide, dark, and far too knowing for a child only seconds into this world. Annie Talbot held him close to her chest, breath shallow, blood cooling too fast beneath her. The midwife hadn't said a word in minutes. She just stood there, hands limp at her sides, her face drawn tight with something that looked like fear, or shame, or worse. Annie's fingers trembled as she pulled back the blanket to see him clearly. His skin was darker than hers, noticeably so, smooth and warm like clay fresh from riverbank soil, so unlike her own pale freckled arms. The room was too quiet, too still. Annie looked up, voice raw from the hours of labor. "He's perfect," she whispered. "He's mine." But silence stretched longer, colder. The midwife turned without a word and left, not even a goodbye, not even a name for the record. Just the hollow slam of the door. By morning, the town already knew. It started as it always did in a place like Dry Creek behind lace curtains and church pews. A whisper from the preacher's wife, a glance from the general store clerk that lasted just a little too long. And by the time Annie managed to bundle her newborn and carry him to the doctor for a checkup, the looks had turned to words. What did she do out by the reservation? Shameful. Should have known better. That Talbot girl. The doctor didn't touch the child, didn't even come close. "He looks healthy," he muttered from across the room. "Won't be needing me, I expect." Then he turned and left Annie standing there, clutching her baby against her breast like he might be ripped from her arms at any second. And maybe he would be. She'd seen what they did to folks who didn't fit. She just never thought she'd be one of them. The baby's name was Isaac. She'd chosen it long before she ever missed a cycle, long before the man who had given her that name rode off without a promise or a backward glance. His name was Rook, half Lakota, half Shadow. He came through Dry Creek like a storm quite, sudden and full of strange truths. Annie had met him at the river bend, where her father's cattle grazed and where she often escaped the noise of her mother's scorn. He was respectful, gentle, and dangerous in the way only a man who's seen too much could be. He told her stories, taught her songs in a language that rolled like wind through pine. She'd known what people would say if they saw her with him. But the world fell away when he touched her face, when he said her name like it mattered. When he looked at her like she wasn't just a girl stuck between a dying town and a bitter family. She never expected him to stay, but she hadn't expected the baby either. And now she was alone. Annie worked the seamstress table behind the mercantile. It was the only place that would take her after Isaac was born. Mr. Greeley didn't much care what color the baby was, as long as Annie kept the orders filled and her mouth shut. But his wife, Miriam, made sure the chair closest to Annie stayed empty, as if Isaac's skin might rub off on the others. Every day Annie sat in that back room stitching buttons onto Warren, shirts and patching trousers, while Isaac lay swaddled in a basket beside her. And every day the whispers got louder. Mixed blood, reservation bastard. She don't even know who the father is. One afternoon, a woman came in with her boy and yanked him away from the basket like Isaac was poison. "You don't play near that thing here," she snapped. Annie didn't say a word. She just held Isaac tighter. Then came the fire. It wasn't large. Just a small bundle of rags lit outside the door of her rented room above the stables. But it was a message. The smoke curled through the cracks in the floorboards. Isaac coughed, eyes wide in panic, as Annie wrapped him tight and ran into the night, barefoot and shaking. No one came to help, No bucket brigade, no questions. Just cold stares as she stood in the snow outside, her child pressed against her chest. Maybe now she'll take the hint, someone said. She didn't sleep that night. She barely breathed Dot by morning. She was gone. Annie packed what little she had into a flour sack and left town before the sun rose. She followed the river west, away from Dry Creek, toward the land Rook once spoke of. She didn't know where the Lakota camp was anymore. Last she heard, they'd been pushed north after the army raids. But she had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. She kept to the trees when she could, ate roots, boiled pine needles, nursed her child in the shelter of rocks. Every time Isaac cried, her heart broke all over again, not because of the sound, but because of what it meant that he was alive. And that meant the world still had time to take him. On the seventh day, she collapsed. Her feet were blistered, her lips cracked, her hands raw from cold and desperation. She laid Isaac in the crook of her arm and curled around him, praying silently to every god Rook had ever mentioned. Wind howled through the trees. Snow began to fall again. She whispered his name. Isaac, baby, stay with me until her voice gave out, until her eyelids sagged, until her heartbeat slowed. Dot. Then came the drum. Dot, distant at first, faint, then louder, steadier, like thunder rolling slow across the hills. Hooves, more than one. Annie couldn't move, couldn't speak. But she saw the shadow stretch across the snow, tall and wide and mounted. A voice spoke in Lakota, low, calm, then English. She's still breathing. She woke by firelight. She was in a tipi. Smoke drifted gently through the top vent. Isaac was beside her, warm, fed, clean. A woman sat nearby tending a pot, her braids streaked with gray. You crossed the river alone, the woman said, not unkindly, with a child not yet weaned. Annie nodded, her throat sore. I had nowhere else. The woman studied her a long moment. You do now. Outside, the camp moved with quiet rhythm, children playing, men tending horses, women sewing and cooking and carrying. Annie's arrival stirred glances, whispers, but not cruelty. Not like Dry Creek. When night fell, the one they called Chief Two Crows came to her fire. He was not old, but his eyes were. He looked at Isaac for a long time. Then he said one word, Rook. Annie's breath caught. You know him? She asked. Two Crows nodded slowly. He is my son. A silence fell so heavy, it almost crushed her. The fire popped between them. Isaac stirred in his blanket. And then, without hesitation, the chief stood and reached for the child. Annie tensed, but Two Crows didn't take him. He placed a hand gently on Isaac's head, spoke in Lakota, then looked Annie dead in the eye. He is blood, he said. Ours. The words settled like thunder inside her chest. Ours, not yours, not stranger's blood or burden to carry, just ours. And in that single word, Annie felt something loosen some knot in her rib cage that had kept her from breathing fully since the day Isaac was born. She hadn't come to this place expecting mercy. She hadn't come expecting anything but shelter and time enough to figure out what came next. But now, faced with the man who'd fathered the one person who hadn't turned away from her, she found her knees buckling. Her fingers clutched Isaac tighter, but not from fear, from disbelief. Why didn't he come back? She asked, the question slipping out like water from a cracked jug. Rook, he knew about the baby, he had to. Two Crows didn't answer right away. He just stared into the fire, his face carved from stone and years. Finally, he said, my son walks a trail that does not circle back. Not often. He came here not long after the snows began, wounded, lost, I asked him who broke him. He looked at her then, sharp as flint. He said, "Me." Annie sat in silence, tears threatening. She wanted to scream, to ask why Rook had left her, to raise Isaac alone, to survive the poison of Dry Creek and the hate that grew there like fungus. But in the same breath, she realized how hollow that scream would be. Rook hadn't run because he didn't care. He'd run because he didn't know how to stay. Because maybe no one ever taught him how. She looked down at Isaac, his tiny fist curled around a strip of her dress. "I don't want him to grow up ashamed of himself," she whispered. "Not for his skin, not for who his father was, not for any of it." Two crows nodded once, then stay. Let him grow here. Among his people, it wasn't a decision. It was oxygen. The weeks that followed didn't offer ease-only rhythm. But rhythm was something Annie had forgotten to need. In Dry Creek, she had tiptoed through every hour, braced for another door. To slam, another neighbor to spit her name like a curse. Here, there were still wary looks, but they didn't cut. They didn't carry the sharpness of rejection. The women gave her tasks: grinding corn, drying hides, learning the soft, wordless lullabies that passed from mother to child like inherited breath. Isaac grew stronger. He laughed for the first time when an old man painted his cheeks with ash and called him Little Bear. He took his first crawling steps toward the fire. The people began to soften. But the peace wasn't made to last. It began when a trader wagon passed near the valley. Two men, rifles strapped behind them, spotted Annie collecting firewood with another woman. They didn't speak to her, but they watched too long. Their horses circled back. Annie froze. Something about their faces chilled her more than the wind. She recognized one Naki. He used to work at the blacksmith in Dry Creek. He used to catcall her from the porch, lips stained with chew. And now, when he saw her standing barefoot in buckskin, child tied to her hip, he smiled like someone who'd found a secret worth selling. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. Talbot girls gone native. Annie said nothing. But her spine stiffened. When the men finally rode off, the woman beside her, Shauna, murmured low, "Trouble follows mouths like theirs." She was right. The next day, two crows called a meeting of the elders. He sat in the center of the gathering circle, voice calm but firm. "They know she is here, and where she is, hate follows. We must decide." Annie watched from the edge, holding Isaac, every breath lodged behind her ribs. One of the older men, Gray Fox, looked at her with eyes that had seen the trail of tears. "And the treaties broken after. Why should her presence threaten us?" he asked. "She is one woman with a child." Two crows didn't flinch. Because the men who mock a woman's child today return tomorrow with torches, or soldiers. The camp buzzed with unease. But then, like a knife cutting clean through fog, a voice rose behind Annie. It was Shauna. "Then let them come," she said. "Let them see a mother protected." No one argued. That night, Annie sat by the fire with her son sleeping in her arms. The stars above were sharp and countless. She remembered the scripture her mother used to recite when Annie was small. "The star shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken." She used to be afraid of that verse. Now it felt like a promise. Let the stars fall. Let the sky split. As long as she had this boy in her arms and this camp at her back, she could face it. But morning came with smoke, not thick, not blazing, just the smell sharp, bitter, foreign. It came from the ridge. Scouts returned breathless. 4 riders. 2 wagons, more on foot, armed. 2 crows didn't blink. "How long?" he asked. "An hour, maybe less." Annie stood up. "They're here for me." 2 crows nodded. "Then you will not face them alone." What followed happened fast like. lightning snapping the edge of the world. The camp moved with silent speed. Women gathered the children. Men mounted horses. Arrows were dipped in oil, rifles loaded. 2 crows handed Annie a small blade. If they get through, do not let them take him. She didn't ask what he meant. She understood. The riders appeared just past the tree-line Dry Creek men. Townsfolk who once bought her thread and smiled fake in her face. Now they looked at her like she was a disease. Mackie led them. "We come for the boy," he shouted, "and the one who birthed him." 2 crows stepped forward. "This is Lakota land. You come with weapons. You come as enemies." Mackie laughed. "You think this dust heap counts as land? You think anybody outside this valley cares who squats on it?" His rifle cocked. I said, "Hand him over." Then came the arrow dot silent. Sudden, it struck the snow inches from Mackie's horse. The beast reared, but Mackie held fast. "You want war?" he barked. "Over a half-breed?" 2 crows didn't raise his voice. "We want peace. But we'll bury it in your bones if we must." Tension snapped like ice cracking underfoot. Guns lifted. Arrows drew taut. Annie backed into the tent, clutching Isaac, blade in hand. She prayed he wouldn't wake. She prayed she'd be enough. Outside, someone shouted dot, then a new voice rang out dot deep, steady, familiar. "Put your guns down." Every head turned. A rider stood alone at the edge of the trees. Dressed in a dust-caked duster, rifle slung across his back, hair braided with a single white feather. His face carved and tired, eyes like dusk. Rook. Annie gasped. Her knees nearly gave out. Rook didn't look at her. Not yet. His eyes stayed on Mackie. "You fire 1 shot here," he said, "and you die with it." Mackie squinted. "You got no right. You don't even belong here anymore." Rook rode forward. "That child in her arms? That's my blood. And you want war over him?" He dismounted slowly. "Then start with me." Mackie hesitated. The line between bravery and stupidity flickered in his eyes like a dying lantern. Then he spat. "Not worth it." He turned his horse. "This ain't over." But it was for. Now the townsfolk retreated. The valley exhaled. Annie stepped from the tent, eyes locked on Rook. He looked older, broken, but real. She stood in silence, heart pounding in her throat. He looked at Isaac, then at her. "I came back," he said simply. Annie didn't know whether to slap him or fall into his arms. She did neither. She handed him the child, and for the first time since Dry Creek turned its back on her, she watched as someone held her son with pride, not shame, not fear. Rook looked down at Isaac and whispered something in Lakota, voice cracking. "He has your eyes," Annie murmured. "But your soul, I think." Rook nodded. "Then he'll need both." Rook stayed silent through the night. He sat with Isaac in his arms, as if afraid the boy would vanish if he blinked. His back hunched forward, shoulders still bearing the memory of a burden too long carried alone. Annie didn't speak either. She sat across the fire, arms around her knees, staring into the flames as if they might explain the man who had once kissed her with the reverence of a vow, then vanished like he'd never meant a word of it. The only sounds were the night wind, the creak of tents swaying gently in the dark, and the soft cooing of Isaac against his father's chest. Dawn broke with no apology. It painted the hills pale gold, and in its light, Rook looked older than Annie remembered, not just tired weathered, like a man who had walked through places he refused to speak of. She waited until Isaac was asleep again in the crook of a fir. Then she rose and crossed a few feet between them. Rook didn't look. "Up, I buried your letters," he said. Her breath hitched. "What letters?" "All the ones I wrote and never sent." She stared at him. "You could have come. You knew." I knew I'd ruin him, he said, voice flat. Like I ruined everything else I ever touched. Annie didn't slap him, though every bone in her hand begged to. Instead, she sat beside him. He needed you, she whispered. So did I. Rook turned his face away, jaw tight. I saw what they did to you. I heard. I was just a shadow by then, moving between places. Didn't know if coming back would protect you or paint a target twice as wide. You are already gone, Win. The stairs started, she said, and her voice trembled with all the bitterness she hadn't spoken aloud until now. It wasn't just about you. They hated what he looked like. What I looked like with him. Like I'd committed a sin. Rook swallowed hard. You didn't. Annie laughed bitterly. Funny, I was the one getting spat at. He reached for her hand then, not to hold it, just to touch the back of it, like confirming she was real. I thought the only thing I could give him was distance. You were wrong, she said. But she didn't pull her hand away. That day, word spread through the valley. The threat from Dry Creek wasn't over. The men had pulled back, but not surrendered. The scouts spotted fires burning beyond the ridge's makeshift camps, too far. Off for peace. They were gathering, waiting, and in their waiting, they were planning. 2 crows stood before the camp again, this time with Rook at his side. The tension had shifted now. The camp no longer doubted Annie, but some questioned Rook. One man, Harrow, stepped forward. He walked away once, he said. What makes us think he won't do it again when the shooting starts? Rook didn't flinch. You don't have to trust me, he said. But I've got more to lose here than any of you. He turned, looked directly at Annie and the child in her arms. This time, I stay. Preparations began. The valley was no stranger to defense. Barricades were reinforced, watch posts built along the natural ledges of stone. But the people weren't warriors by trade. They were families. Mothers, elders, children. This wasn't a fort. It was a home with walls made of prayer and threadbare resolve. Rook took lead over the younger men, teaching them not just how to aim a rifle, but how to listen, how to move as one body, to defend without bloodthirst. Every night he returned to Annie and Isaac. He never asked if he could. He just came. Some nights he told the boys stories in Lakota, voice so gentle it made Annie's heart twist. Other nights he didn't speak at all, just rested with his back against the firs, eyes half closed, exhaustion tugging at his bones. Annie watched him sleep, once face softened by firelight, and realized, for all her rage, part of her had never stopped waiting for this. For him, but it wasn't as simple as returning. Love wasn't a switch. She confronted him one night when Isaac was asleep and the fire had died low. What happens after? She asked. Rook looked up. After what? After they leave. Or, after they don't. If we survive this, do you disappear again? No. She waited. I don't know how to live in a place like Dry Creek, he said, but I'll learn how to live here. If you'll let me. Annie didn't answer. Not with words. She took his hand and placed it gently on her chest, over the place where her heartbeat thudded like hooves. He left it there, wordless. But peace, again, was not made to last. 3 nights later, the first fire broke out. It came from the west edge of the valley, near the livestock pens. Shouts rang out. By the time Rook and a handful of men reached the blaze, half the pen was already lost, the animals scattered. And pinned to the wooden post at the edge of the fire was a crude sign carved into bark. Breed with savages, burn with them. Annie felt her knees give. They hadn't just come to fight. They'd come to destroy from the inside. The next day, the council met. Panic stirred at the edges of their voices. Some whispered of leaving, of taking the children and fleeing north, letting the valley be lost rather than dying for it. But 2 crows shook his head. "We are not smoke to be scattered," he said. "We are stone, and we will not be moved." Still the days darkened. A cold front came early unseasonal, bitter. Frost ate through the tents. A child fell ill, then another. The elders began burning medicine herbs round the clock. Annie took shifts keeping the fires alive, hands blistered from heat. Rook stayed out past dusk, watching for movement along the ridge. One morning, a girl went missing. She had gone to the stream to fetch water. Hours passed. Then a scream echoed through the valley, shrill and sharp. They found her barely, her dress torn, mouth bruised, eyes wide with a terror too deep to name. Annie held her close while the healer whispered blessings. That night, no one slept. "They're testing us," Rook said. "Trying to bleed us." "Out slow," Annie nodded. "Then we have to stop waiting." Two crows looked at them. "What do you propose?" Rook rose. "We take the fight to them," gasps echoed. But Annie stood too. "They will not stop. Unless we show them we're not prey." It wasn't easy. Half the council disagreed. But the other half remembered too well what happened to people who waited for mercy. Rook assembled a small group, 5 men and 2 women, swift and silent. Their aim wasn't war. It was warning. They would slip through the dark, find the camp, let them know they were seen, that there would be no more terror in the shadows. They left at dusk. Annie watched them disappear into the black, and then nothing. One night passed, and 2. On the 3rd night, 1 man returned, alone, bleeding, eyes wild. "They knew," he rasped. "They were waiting." Rook hadn't come back. Annie's body froze, blood draining to her feet. "Where?" she whispered. "They took him," the man coughed. "He led us away so we could escape. They took him." 2 crows grabbed his staff. "We leave now." But the scouts warned that it was a trap, that if they rushed in, they'd lose half the valley with it. Annie stood in the firelight, the whole camp watching her. Isaac cried in her arms, unaware of the storm his father had walked into. And in that moment, she knew, if she didn't go, no one would. She kissed Isaac once, hard, handed him to Shauna, and grabbed the knife 2 crows had given her weeks ago. "He came back for us," she said. "Now I'm going to bring him home." And before they could stop her, Annie disappeared into the dark. The stars above the valley stretched cold and sharp, like broken glass scattered across the sky. Annie moved beneath them with the silence of someone who no longer feared dying. Her steps carried more purpose than caution. She didn't skirt. Shadows she became one, her frame wrapped tight in a dark wool shawl, her boots muffled by dirt and pine. The valley behind her slept restlessly, and ahead lay the ridge beyond which Rook had vanished. She didn't look back. Not once. Not even when Isaac's last cry echoed faintly from camp. The trails grew steeper the closer she got to the pass. The old buffalo path wound between stone ridges and trees that had stood long before the first white wagon dared this land. Annie paused only to drink from a half-frozen stream, and once to bury the sharp scream that burst from her when her foot slipped and twisted hard. She bit her sleeve, staggered upright, and kept walking. She found the first sign of them before sunrise, a thread of smoke rising low and thin from behind a rock face. The sun was still hidden, but the firelight below gave away their location. She crept forward, lying flat against the earth as she peered down from a ledge. The camp was small, maybe 10 men, all wrapped in military coats too clean for their cause. A few wore badges, but Annie knew better than to think them lawmen. These weren't deputies. These were ghosts of the war, men who hadn't found peace after blood and went looking for new enemies. Some had the wild-eyed look of zealots. Others looked empty as old shells. And at the center of it all, chained to a post like a trophy, was Rook. He knelt, wrists tied behind his back, with rope tight enough to bleed. His lip was split, one eye nearly swollen shut. But he was alive, breathing. Annie didn't let herself feel relief, not yet. One of the men stirred, kicking dirt at the fire. "You hear me, savage?" he barked. "Ain't no squaw coming for you." Rook didn't answer. Another voice chimed in, a quieter one, meaner for its calm. "That child of yours. You think he belongs anywhere? He's nothing, half nothing, ain't white enough to live free, and sure as hell not welcome with your kind." Still, Rook didn't speak. Annie gripped the hilt of her knife tighter. Her breathing came shallow. They didn't know. They had no idea that someone who once bathed the boy's fevered skin through nights of screams now crouched in the rocks above them, heart beating like war drums. But she didn't rush in. She waited, counted how many men were awake, watched who left their post to piss behind the trees, noted which one had the keys clipped to his belt, how often he reached to check they were still there. She had no plan except this: get to Rook, get him out, kill if she had to, die if she had to. When darkness fully reclaimed the camp, and only 2 guards remained on watch, Annie moved. She crawled low, keeping her knife close and her eyes open. A snapped twig would mean death. She felt every heartbeat in her throat. The man with the keys was slumped near the edge of the campfire, flask in hand. He muttered to himself, legs spread wide, rifle on the ground beside him. Annie waited for the flask to reach his mouth, then pounced. She slammed the butt of her knife into his temple once, twice, before he could cry out. He slumped, unconscious. She didn't stop to check if he was breathing. She unclipped the keys, grabbed his rifle, and crawled toward Rook. He saw her before she reached him. For a moment, his battered face flickered, not with hope, but disbelief. She dropped to her knees beside him, saw how the rope had cut deep into his skin. "Don't talk," she whispered. "Don't move," he coughed. "You shouldn't be here. You think I was going to stay back while you played hero." She worked the key into the lock on his cuffs. It stuck. Her fingers shook. "Come on, come on. Behind you." Rook rasped. She turned, just as a shadow lunged. The first shot fired before she even realized the man was armed. It missed her by inches, ripping through her shawl. She drove the knife upward, catching the man in the ribs. He grunted, fell backward, and she scrambled for the dropped pistol. The camp exploded into noise shouts, boots, curses. Rook yanked himself forward, using the post to rise. The cuffs fell away. Annie grabbed his arm, hauling him to his feet. "Run," she gasped. They didn't get far before more men appeared. 2 blocked the ridge path. Annie fired once, then again missed. The first time grazed a leg, the second. Rook tackled the other, wrenching the rifle from his grasp and striking hard enough to break the wood in 2. They tore into the trees. Branches whipped at them. Rook limped. Annie dragged him when he faltered. Behind them, the camp roared to life, torches lighting up the forest. Dogs barked. Gunshots cracked. Annie didn't know how long they ran, only that her lungs burned and her legs screamed for mercy. At last, Rook pulled her behind a fallen log, both of them gasping for air. He pressed his forehead to hers. "I told you to. Stay back," he whispered. "And I told you to never leave again," she replied. A sound snapped behind them, too close. They spun. A man stepped into view. Not one of the soldiers. Lakota. Tall, cloaked in furs, bow drawn, arrow aimed. Behind him, a dozen more emerged like wraiths from the dark. Annie's breath caught. The man lowered his bow. "You run loud," he said in Lakota, "but your hearts are true." Rook stared. "I thought you were dead." The man stepped closer. Firelight caught the side of his face marked with paint, old scars. His gaze softened. "I was," he said. "But the child brought me back." Annie realized, slowly, that she was looking at the chief, the one Rook had spoken of in broken memories, the one they'd all believed lost to time. "Why are you here?" Rook asked. The chief looked at Annie. "Because blood speaks across distance," he said, "and I heard my grandson's cry." Annie's knees went weak. She didn't know whether to sob or fall. Instead, she reached for Rook's hand and held it like it was the only rope keeping her from sinking into the earth. "We take you home," the chief said. And they did. By the time they returned to the valley, the stars had begun to fade. Dawn broke behind them, casting shadows long and thin. The camp stirred as the procession arrived, Rook bloodied but walking, Annie half carried by the chief himself, and behind them, warriors moving like wind ghosts between trees. Isaac wailed. The moment he saw them, Annie nearly collapsed with the sound. She ran, took him in her arms, buried her face in his soft curls. The chief knelt before the child. He took out a blade, not to harm, but to cut a thin strip of his own hair. He tied it to a leather cord and slipped it around Isaac's neck. "This boy is blood," he said. "Mine, and I speak it now before fire and sky." The crowd was silent. Even the wind held its breath. "You mock his skin?" the chief growled. "Then mock me, old as this land. Mock the ones who tamed rivers and rode the storms back. This boy carries 2 nations in him. That makes him more." No one dared speak, not even the council. 2 crows stepped forward. "So it is written," he said, but peace would not follow. Easily, that same night, another rider appeared at the ridge, wounded, barely clinging to the saddle. He collapsed before the fire and gasped one sentence: "They're coming." Rook caught him before he hit the ground. "Who?" "Dry Creek," the man choked. 2 days, maybe less. 50 men. Maybe more. Annie felt the chill sink back. The chief looked at her. "We'll hold," he said, but Annie saw what he didn't say in his eyes. They might not survive this one. The drums started at dusk. Not the ceremonial kind that welcomed harvest or marriage, but the kind that reached into a man's bones and reminded him what fear tasted like. Slow, steady, and far too calm, they had all the time in the world. To kill. Annie sat near the fire. Isaac pressed close to her chest, the boy too young to understand what was coming, but old enough to feel it. Every beat of those drums made him cling tighter. The chief had not slept. Since the rider collapsed, at the edge of camp, he hadn't closed his eyes once. He stood like a statue carved from war itself, speaking to his warriors in low voices, hands never straying far from the bow slung across his back. His face was calm. His heart, Annie suspected, was anything but. Rook watched him closely, half listening, half grieving. The bruises on his face had turned yellow at the edges, but the light hadn't quite returned to his eyes. Not since he heard the name Dry Creek. "They're mercenaries," Rook muttered beside her, his voice low. "Used to work for the rail lines. Now they just sell themselves to whoever pays more. Raiders, thugs. Most of them ex-soldiers. Some were Confederates who never laid down their flags. And they want Isaac? They want land, blood, message. Doesn't matter which they get first." He paused, then added more quietly, "They'll kill him if they can." Annie closed her eyes and held Isaac tighter. By morning, the scouts confirmed it 50 men, riding fast, flying no flags, moving like a storm that had already made up its mind. They'd reached the valley by sundown. The council met under the old tree, branches bare and black against the pale sky. Annie stood with Rook, half listening as names were whispered, plans drawn, escape routes discussed. The chief remained silent until the last voice died down. Then he spoke only one word. No. Heads turned. Even 2 crows frowned. We do. Not run, the chief said. We do not give them the boy. We do not let ghosts dictate how we live. But we are few, one of the younger warriors said. And they are cowards, the chief snapped. Men with guns, yes, but hearts made of ash. And they expect fear. They feed on it. Annie looked around and saw tired eyes, nervous glances. Even those who had once danced with fire now stood unsure, as if dawn itself was too heavy. She stepped forward before she could stop herself. Then let them know this isn't just your fight, it's mine too. They come for my child, for our child, and they'll meet a mother who won't let him be taken. Her voice broke on the last word. She hated that, but something in it struck the crowd. A murmur rose. Rook stepped beside her, his hand brushing hers, fingers raw from carving arrows. All night. The chief nodded. Then we prepare. They built barricades of logs and stone. Women who'd never held a rifle practiced with trembling hands. The elderly sharpened knives, mixed poultices. Children were hidden in the caves along the ridge, watched over by the few too frail to fight. Annie helped where she could, boiling water, gathering roots, stuffing cloth into glass bottles. She found herself at the fire again, stirring resin and oil while Isaac slept in a sling across her back. Every now and then she'd look toward the horizon and see them dots, slowly becoming shapes, slowly becoming men. Rook touched her shoulder. They'll break before we do. She wanted to believe him. The first shot cracked through the valley like thunder just after sunset. It wasn't aimed at anyone, just a warning. The mercenaries had stopped at the tree line, just out of bow range. Fire sprang up on their side. Campfires? No, torches. They weren't camping. They were taunting. Voice rose from the dark. Loud, cocky. You got what we came for. You hand over the baby, we ride out. No one else has to die. The chief didn't answer. The voice laughed. Don't be stupid, old man. He ain't even yours. Annie stepped forward, fury sharp and hot in her throat. He's more yours than you ever were to this land. Silence. Then you must be the mama. We'll make sure to keep you alive. The chief raised his hand. No words, just a signal, and the sky lit up. Arrows dozens soared from behind rocks, trees, ridge lines. Flames erupted where torches fell. Men screamed, horses bucked. The mercenaries scrambled for cover. It had begun. Rook fired beside her, the rifle steady in his hands. Annie dragged Isaac into a dugout pit and shoved a pillow over his ears before grabbing her own weapon. She wasn't a marksman, but she knew how to shoot. More importantly, she knew why she had to. For hours, the valley rang with fire and fury. The mercenaries charged once, then twice, both times, beaten back by traps and arrows, in sheer refusal to fall. Bodies littered the slope. Blood soaked into snow. A woman named Tansy took a shot to the chest and still managed to throw a lit bottle that set a wagon ablaze. At midnight, they paused, regrouped. Annie's hands shook. She'd lost count of how many bullets were left. Rook was bleeding from a chi, cut near his ribs. The chief still hadn't sat down. They'll come harder now, 2 crows said. They'll come stupid, the chief replied. And that's when we kill them. But there was one problem. They weren't alone anymore. A second wave arrived just before dawn. New horses, new riders, and among them, a flag Annie hadn't seen in years. Confederate gray. It snapped in the wind like the past trying to rise from. It's grave, Rook spat. They called in allies. The chief's jaw tightened. Then so will we. No one understood what he meant until he turned toward the old drum near the council tree. He lifted it, huge, heavy, sacred, and beat it once, then again. And again. The rhythm was different. Not a warning. Not a challenge. A call. Within the hour. Riders appeared from the eastern ridge, distant silhouettes at first. Then closer, closer, until Annie saw feathers, war paint, black horses wrapped in talismans. Other tribes. Other warriors. Some hadn't spoken to the Lakota in years. But blood. Calls to blood. They'd come, and the valley shifted. The chief looked at the newcomers. Protect the child. An elder rider nodded. We saw his face in fire. We knew he was coming long before he cried. Annie whispered, "Then why didn't you come sooner?" The rider turned to her. "You had to fight for him first." That's how ancestors test love. The final siege began without ceremony. Guns fired. Arrows flew. Smoke choked the air. Annie lost track of where Rook was, but she trusted the wind to carry him back. She fought like a woman who no longer feared dying, who only feared losing the little life wrapped in a wool sling on her chest. At one point, they breached the wall. 3 men made it into the village. One grabbed her by the hair. She stabbed him through the thigh and bit his ear clean off before another woman split his skull with a rock. They didn't ask names. They didn't have to. This was not a war about land. It was about who was allowed to live. Isaac didn't cry once. Not when the walls burned. Not when the wind screamed with bullets. Not even when Annie threw herself over him, praying her body would be enough. And then silence, like the land itself. Exhaled. Bodies everywhere. But only one flag still flew. Not the gray one, not the white. Man's, but a single strip of red cloth, marked with a child's name. Isaac. Annie collapsed beside him, face streaked with ash, hands raw. Rook found them there. He dropped to his knees. "I thought I lost you," he whispered. "You never had." "To find me," she replied. "I was never leaving." Above them, the chief raised a hand toward the sky. "Let it be known," he said, voice hoarse, "this child is no accident. He is proof that from war comes fire. From fire comes iron, and from iron a future." But as the sun rose, a final rider appeared, carrying a letter, stamped with a federal seal, and orders. To remove the tribe from the valley. In 3 days. The letter came in silence, but it struck louder than any bullet. The rider, a boy no older than 15, with shoes too clean for any land that had tasted blood, delivered it without a word, his hand trembling as he passed the envelope to the chief. Then he turned and rode off before anyone could speak. Like even he knew what he carried wasn't a message, but a sentence. The chief didn't open it immediately. He stood beneath the charred branches of the council tree, the last curls of smoke still rising from the battle-scarred ground. Warriors knelt around the dead, singing the mourning songs, placing stones over eyes. Women tended to the wounded, weaving cloth through flesh and stitching what could be saved. But all movement slowed when the chief finally tore the envelope open. The paper crackled in his weathered hands. His face gave nothing away, but Annie didn't need to see the words to know the government had chosen now, of all times, to take the valley. No matter the blood spent to defend it, no matter the child they'd protected. They hadn't just survived a siege. They'd bought themselves a countdown, 3 days. And they would be forced to leave. It was 2 crows who asked what everyone else was thinking. Do we run again? No. The chief said simply, "We decide." Annie sat near the fire, her arms still aching from the weight of Isaac, who now slept with one tiny hand curled around the fringe of her shawl. Rook crouched beside her, bruised, bandaged, quiet. She'd seen him cry once during the fight, when one of the mercenaries collapsed and called out to a son that wasn't there. "They'll call it justice," Rook muttered, "or policy, or progress." "They always do," Annie replied. She didn't ask to read the letter. She didn't have to. She'd seen its contents written across the history of too many faces. The valley wasn't being taken because of Isaac. It was being taken because they had dared to protect him. Because love that didn't fit inside their rules had spilled. Over, and they were afraid. That night, the council met again. Only this time, the fire burned low, and the chief did not sit on the high stone. "This land is not just land," he began. "It is memory. It is bone. It is breath. But they will call it theirs, and if we bleed again, they will call us savages." A woman named Suna, whose husband had died defending the eastern wall, stood with tears in her eyes. Then what do? We do? Let them push us into dust again? No, the chief said. We do not run, but we do not fight like before. His eyes settled on Annie. Her story is the story they fear. A mother who did not belong. A child they tried to erase. And a people who called him one of us. What are you saying? Rook asked slowly. I'm saying we make it so loud they can't silence it. In the days that followed, the valley transformed Not into a fortress, into a message. The villagers began carving, painting, recording. Every hut was turned into a canvas. Stories were painted across walls of the battle, of Isaac, of the mercenaries who bled under a flag that no longer flew. Songs were written in 4 languages. Trails were burned with symbols older than the country that now tried to erase them. Mothers stitched the names of the fallen into blankets. Children were taught the words, "Remember us," before they learned to spell their own. And at the center of it all, they built a monument not of stone, but of breath. Every member of the tribe young, old, warrior, or healer stood before a tree at the center of camp, where a single red ribbon had been tied around the trunk. One by one, they each added a ribbon. Each one a promise, each one a name, each one a refusal to disappear. Annie stood in, lying with Isaac on her hip. When her turn came, she tied her ribbon tightly and whispered into the bark, "Your name is not a mistake. Your face is not a curse. You are a storm and a song and a sunrise." When she stepped back, Isaac reached out a hand toward the tree. The wind rustled the ribbons gently, as if the land itself was listening. But the days passed fast. And on the morning of the 3rd, a cloud of dust rose in the west. Soldiers. Blue coats this time. Not mercenaries, real ones. 20 men mounted and carrying the seal of the U.S. government. The lead officer was a tall man with sharp boots and a face too smooth for someone whose eyes were that tired. He rode up to the edge of camp, dismounted, and walked forward alone. No gun, no drawn sword. Just the letter Annie had already seen. "You've been given notice," he said. "This land is to be cleared for resettlement." The chief didn't answer. Behind him, the people stood like stone. The officer tried again. "This doesn't have to be hostile." Annie stepped forward. She was tired of silence. "You're too late." He blinked. "What?" She pointed to the ribbons. To the murals. To the fire still burning in the middle of camp. "You've already lost." The officer looked past her, to the children singing, to the women weaving, to the old man carving Isaac into the wood. He swallowed. "This land belongs to the United States," he tried. "No," the chief said. "This land belongs to a child." "And he doesn't recognize your flag?" The officer hesitated. For a flicker of a moment, Annie saw doubt, not kindness, not mercy, but the recognition that no bullet could unwrite what had already been lived. Then he turned and rode away. No orders given. No shots fired. Just a message, carried back to men who wouldn't understand it. But it didn't end there, because later that night, a second visitor arrived, a woman. She wore no uniform, no badge, just a long coat and boots streaked with dust. Her hair was tied back, her eyes unreadable. but she held a book in one hand. A notebook. She approached Annie directly. "I've read about you." Annie stiffened. "You work for them?" "No," the woman said. "I write about them." She looked around at the camp, the people, the ribbons. "I want to write about him." She pointed gently to Isaac. Annie felt her heart quicken. "Why?" "Because they're going to twist this story. They'll say it was rebellion, terrorism. They'll erase what happened here unless someone tells it first." Rook appeared beside her. "And why should we trust you?" "Because I'm not asking you to trust me," the woman said. "I'm asking you to speak." "I just hold the pen?" The chief came forward, eyes locked on hers. "You carry your own ghosts?" She nodded. "Once, more than I can count." He gestured to the fire. "Then sit." For hours, the tribe told their story. Not just the battle, but what came before. What Annie had endured. The towns that had spat on her. The nights Isaac cried and no one came. The first time the chief saw the boy's eyes and said he had seen them in a dream. The writer listened and wrote. Page after page after page. When dawn came, she stood to leave. "I can't promise they'll believe it," she said, "but I'll make sure they can't pretend they never heard it." She looked at Isaac. He's going to change more than this valley. Annie held her son close. He already has. But peace, as always, is brief. Because just after the writer disappeared into the morning, 2 crows ran from the ridge, breath ragged, eyes wild. "They're back," he gasped. "Not the soldiers. Them. The ones from Dry Creek." Annie's stomach dropped. "The mercenaries?" Rook cursed under his breath. No flags. No orders. Just revenge. The chief nodded slowly. "Then let the mountain hear us again." And in the distance, the sound of hooves, and fire, and fury. They came not like a storm, but like rot slow at first, barely seen, barely noticed, until you realized it had already eaten through the beams of your home. 20 men, maybe more. No uniforms, no orders, no law behind them. Just dust, guns, and rage. They came on stolen horses, wearing pieces of old badges, and tied red cloths around their arms, like it meant something. Rook saw them first his back to the tree line, bow in hand, and he said later it wasn't the horses or the weapons that made his blood run cold. It was the grins. Loose, wild, cracked grins like boys playing war, except there were no rules, no mercy, and no one left to tell them to stop. The chief didn't wait for them to strike. He ordered everyone back inside the perimeter wall, closed the east gate, and lit the beacons again. By this time, there'd be no time to rally outsiders. There'd be no outside help. This wasn't a siege. This wasn't a stand. This was going to be blood on bark. "Where's Isaac?" Annie's voice cracked as she ran through the camp. In the medicine tent, Suna called, already dragging a crate to block the door. Annie rushed in. The boy was curled on a bed of woven cloth, wide-eyed but silent, as if even at his age he understood what rolled toward them. She scooped him up and held him against her chest. "You stay quiet," she whispered, "no matter what you hear. You stay quiet and you stay here, and you do not let go of that ribbon." Outside, the men were organizing quickly. Not just the warriors, everyone. The old, the wounded, the children. They weren't trying to hold the valley. They were trying to hold each other. The chief stood at the center of it all, as calm as a stone, murmuring instructions to Rook, 2 crows, Suna, anyone who could hold a weapon or swing a hammer. Rook stopped at Annie's side for just a breath. "You should hide." "No. You've done enough." "I'll never be done." They didn't speak again. They didn't have time. A shot rang out, not a warning shot, not a message, but the crack of violence being born again, and then all hell broke loose. They hit the east wall first. Fire arrows. Crude ladders. a battering ram made from a wagon axle. But the people were ready. 2 crows led the defense with a spear in each hand and a scream in his throat that didn't sound human. Suna and the women rained rocks and boiling water from above. One of the invaders climbed halfway before a child kicked him square in the jaw and sent him tumbling back into the dirt. But they didn't stop. They never stopped. Annie saw one of them break through the barricade near the old stable. She ran Isaac still pressed against her and ducked into the shadows. She watched the man pass by, dragging a torch behind him, muttering something she couldn't understand. When he passed, she bolted to the other side of camp, where the chief stood with a bow in one hand and a broken staff in the other. "We have to draw them out," he said. "Split them. Confuse them." "You mean bait them," Rook answered, blood already running down one arm. The chief looked at Annie. "No," she said instantly. "They came for him." "No, they won't stop until they get what they think they came for." "You want to use him? I want to end this." Annie clutched Isaac tighter, but the truth already clawed its way through her gut. They weren't here for land. They weren't here for war, Dot. They were here because something about a child being loved enraged them more than any rifle ever could. The chief didn't ask again. He just nodded once and turned away. But it was Rook who returned moments later, bandaged now, his face smeared with ash. "I know a way to draw them off. One of the old deer trails. We lure them halfway into the forest, then trap the valley behind them. You think they'll follow? They're not here to win. They're here to destroy. That kind of hate doesn't think." Annie looked at Isaac, who reached up to touch her face. She kissed his fingers and handed him to Rook. "Run," she whispered. Rook hesitated only for a heartbeat, but then took the child and vanished into the woods like smoke. Dot. By the time the attackers realized Isaac was gone, half the village was already burning. The mercenaries screamed curses, slashed tents, upturned sacred stones. One of them stood on a barrel and shouted, "Bring us the boy, and we'll leave the rest." Annie stepped into the open. Her arms were empty, her hair matted with ash. "You'll never find him," she said. The man raised his rifle, but he never got the chance to pull the trigger. Because the mountain opened up behind him, dozens of villagers surged from the smoke, 2 crows leading the charge, his spear catching the light like a falling star. They hit hard, fast, brutal, not to kill, to drive back, to scatter, to end it. And through the chaos, Annie ran dodging fire, ducking under fallen beams, dragging wounded behind her, until she found Suna bleeding against the monument tree. She dropped beside her. "Stay with me," Suna coughed blood. "Did he make it?" "He's safe." A weak smile. "Then it's worth it." And then she was gone. The battle didn't end in glory. It ended in ash. When the sun finally broke through the smoke, only 4 attackers were left alive, wounded, bound, broken in spirit. They didn't speak. They didn't fight. They just sat in the dirt and waited for someone to decide their fate. But there was no execution. Only silence and fire. And the chief placing the last of the ribbons on the tree, one hand on the bark, one hand on his heart. Suna's name was the last added. Later that night, Annie walked alone to the medicine tent. Rook was there, rocking Isaac in his arms. He looked up when she entered. "You were right," he said softly. "He is the future." Annie knelt beside them. "No," she said. "He's the present. He's now. And they can't take that from him." The chief joined them just before dawn. He placed something in Annie's hand, a small wooden carving. A hawk, wings spread, eyes fierce. "For him," he said. Annie looked up. "What happens now?" The chief didn't answer right away. He just watched the sky change color. "They'll come again," he said finally. "Different uniforms, different names. Same fear." Annie nodded slowly. "Then we stay ready." "No," he said. Then we keep living, loudly, bravely, as if they're already gone. And from the shadows of the trees, the writer returned, her notebook full, her eyes full of fire. "I'm not done," she said. "The world needs to hear all of it." Annie met her gaze, then right fast, because in the distance, a new banner had peered on the horizon. And the next fight would not be with guns. It would be with truth. And lies, and everything in between. They buried the dead at dawn, not because tradition demanded it, but because the earth was still cool enough to dig. No speeches, no fanfare, just dirt and silence, and hands trembling from both grief and exhaustion. Annie stood at the foot of Suna's grave. Isaac pressed to her chest. He was quiet, wide-eyed, clutching the hawk carving the chief had given him. She hadn't cried, not during the attack, not when Rook stumbled in with blood across his brow, not even when Suna's body went still in her arms. But now, with the valley hushed and the survivors standing like ghosts around fresh mounds of earth, the tears came. Slow, hot, and relentless. The chief led the last shovelful of dirt over Suna's heart and said nothing. He hadn't spoken much since the fighting ended, not in the way he used to. His presence remained strong, his posture unshaken, but something in his gaze had changed, like a piece of him had been laid to rest, too, and no one dared speak its name. Rook stood at Annie's side, one arm bandaged to the elbow, his knife still hanging at his hip, though the danger had passed. He glanced down at Isaac. "He hasn't made a sound since yesterday." Annie didn't answer. She hadn't either. From the hill above the camp, the rider watched and scribbled in silence. Her name was Merritt. Few knew that yet. She hadn't spoken her own name in years, not since the last town she'd tried to report, from tarred her wagon and burned every page she'd written. But now, as she watched the sunrise spread across a battered but standing camp, her fingers moved with renewed urgency. The world had to know not just of violence, but of resistance, survival, and the child whose birth had become a line drawn in the sand. Isaac, son of no law but every legacy. Later that morning, they gathered to decide what came next. The chief sat in the center of the circle, a bundle of tobacco leaves in his hands, his voice finally cutting the silence. This was not the end. It was only the warning. The ones who came were wild dogs, scavengers. But others will come behind them, more organized, more dangerous. We could move, someone offered. We could scatter. We've rebuilt before, but the chief shook his head. If we run, they will say we were never here. If we hide, they will call us legend. If we scatter, we lose each other. Annie stepped forward, Isaac in her arms. Then we stay. Rook looked at her. And when they come again, she met his gaze. We'll be ready. This time, we weren't. Next time, we are. There was silence, then nods slow at first, but growing. This was their home. Their blood watered its soil. And a child had been born under its sky who would not grow up hiding from it. Still, preparations began immediately. Reinforced walls, hidden food stores, training every hand that could lift a blade or mend a wound. Merritt offered to ride east to send word, to tell the real story before others twisted it. The chief agreed, but only after making her promise to name every fallen one, not just the child who survived. And she did. With every beat of her pencil, she swore it. A week passed, then two. And on the 13th day, a stranger rode into the yet. Valley alone, unarmed. He wore no badge. But he rode like a man who'd once known power. Rook met him at the gate, hand on his bow. The man raised both palms. "I'm not here for war. Then ride back the way you came. I'm here because of what I heard. About a child. A boy." Rook's eyes narrowed. Dark skin, light eyes. No father in sight. Words traveled even out here. You, looking to finish what the others started? No, I'm looking to prevent what comes next. Annie stepped up behind Rook, Isaac on her hip. The man saw her and softened. My name is Barrow, he said. I used to be Law. A long time ago. What do you want? Barrow dismounted, slowly, carefully. I want to help. Because the men who came for you, they weren't just thugs. They're part of something bigger, a movement. Masked in faith, cloaked in patriotism, but rotten to the core. And they're hunting stories like yours. Annie didn't blink. Why us? Because your story threatens theirs. If people see you, if they hear about Isaac, they'll know the truth. That love didn't die. That kin isn't made by blood alone. That hope still lives in places they tried to bury it. The chief approached from the edge of the circle. How do we know you speak true? Barrow unwrapped a satchel from his saddle. Inside was a torn journal, its cover scorched, its pages covered in messy but urgent script. This belonged to my wife. She was a teacher. She tried to protect families like yours when they were being driven out of the border towns. She died for it, but she died believing that words mattered, that stories could outlive bullets. He handed the journal to Annie. Opened it. Inside were drawings, families dark and light, children laughing, a woman with strong hands holding a book like it was a weapon. On the last page, written in a shaky hand, protect what's born of truth, even when it cries. Isaac reached for the page, and Annie didn't stop him. They let Barrow stay. He trained those who wanted to learn strategy, shared maps of where sympathizers might be found, and warned of militias forming under false names in nearby counties. He never claimed leadership, but people listened. He carried the kind of guilt that made a man honest, and the kind of loss that made him dangerous to the wrong people. One night, Merritt returned, blood on her boots and ink smudged on her sleeves. They're printing the story, she said. In St. Louis, Denver, even Chicago. Not all of it, but enough. Will it change anything? Rook asked. It already has. There are people riding here. People who want to stand with you. Annie glanced at the sleeping Isaac. They better ride fast. Because just past the northern ridge, fires had begun to burn again. Not wildfires, not campfires, not organized, evenly spaced, spreading across the horizon like teeth in a mouth too wide to close. The chief watched them with no fear, only resolve. Then, let them come. And beside him, Annie stood tall. Isaac's tiny hand curled around her braid. And she knew, no matter what came next, that this wasn't just about a valley dot. This was about what could not be erased, what could not be mocked out. Of existence, a child, a truth, a family that chose each other. The drums came first, not war drums, not yet. These were ceremonial, deep, steady, relentless. The kind of rhythm meant to remind the blood it still had work to do. The chief stood barefoot on the ridge above the valley where they'd rebuilt there. Lives, arms crossed, watching the smoke rise in the distance. It was early still, sun barely over the mountains, and already the tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. He'd known this day would come. He hadn't expected it so soon. Below, Annie paced with Isaac in her arms, the boy restless, twitching in his sleep. He'd grown heavier these past few weeks, but not in a way you'd notice in inches or pounds. It was the way he looked at people, the way he fell silent when men spoke of loss, or when someone's voice cracked remembering a name carved into the valley's stone memorial. Rook believed it was the weight of Suna's last breath, still tucked somewhere in his soul. Annie didn't try to explain it anymore. She just held him, sang when she could, and waited for the wind to turn. Merritt had stayed longer than planned. After seeing the response to her first dispatch, she'd sent more pages of them, handwritten by candlelight. Stories not just of the attack, but of recovery. of the people who chose to stay, fight, live. Her words had reached more than she expected. Small bands of strangers began arriving, mixed families, former soldiers, traitors turned protectors. They didn't ask for shelter. They asked how they could help defend it. Barrow trained them all. He was methodical, patient, and quieter than he'd been in the beginning. Something haunted him, something about the way he watched Annie with Isaac, or how his eyes always scanned the north even when it was clear. Rook noticed, but didn't press. Trust had built slowly between them, like a fire lit with damp wood. But it had caught, and neither was willing to let it die. That morning, while the drums still echoed in the hills, a rider came, alone again. Only this time there was no introduction, no show of empty hands. He carried a message, folded parchment, sealed with red wax. He handed it to the chief, then turned and rode back without a word. The chief didn't open it. Not immediately. He stood with it in his hand for a long time, feeling the weight of a world that no ink could hold. Finally, he passed it to Annie. She unfolded it slowly. The letter read, "You have until the next full moon to surrender the boy. He is not yours. He is not one of them. You know what we will do. The earth will drink deep. Make the right choice." Rook's voice was ice. "They want Isaac." Merritt looked up from her notes. "They don't just want him. They want the story to die with him." Annie didn't speak. She held Isaac tighter, kissed the crown of his head. She felt his little hand press against her chest, like he could hear the beat of her heart shifting into something colder. The chief finally said, "Then we prepare." The days that followed blurred into one another. The newcomers were divided into shifts: watch, reinforce, forage, train. Rook took lead on fortifications, stringing alarms through the brush, digging escape tunnels from the rear slope. Barrow mapped ambush points, taught quick signaling systems, rotated scouts through high ground. Merritt documented everything, storing pages in weatherproof satchels, burying copies beneath trees in case the worst came. She no longer wrote for glory. She wrote so someone someday would remember what these people stood for. Every night, Annie told Isaac a story before sleep. Sometimes it was about Suna, sometimes about her own mother. Lately, it was about him, about the day he was born. How the sky had turned gold, how the world had paused just long enough to let her believe he would never be hunted. Then the full moon rose, and with it came the fire. They saw it from the ridge, first torches, dozens, then hundreds, marching like a river of flame down the mountain pass. Annie's breath caught in her throat. "They're not coming to talk," Barrow said. "No," said the chief. "They've come to erase." By nightfall, the enemy had encircled the valley. They didn't charge. They just stood, flames licking the sky, silent, waiting. The standoff stretched into morning. Then a voice called out. It was a woman, sharp, steady, too calm. "Give us the boy, and no one else dies." No name, no declaration of who she was or who she served. Just the demand. The chief stepped forward to the front barricade. "You are already too late." "I don't see him?" "Exactly." A pause. Then the woman said, "You will wish you had complied." She turned and disappeared behind the line of men in uniform, but without insignia. Moments later, a horn sounded, and chaos erupted. They came from three sides at once. Rook loosed arrow after arrow from the east wall, while Barrow led a strike team through the tunnel to flank their right. Annie stayed in the center hold with Isaac, surrounded by the oldest and youngest, and the ones too frail to fight. The chief moved through the battle like smoke, swift and unseen, until he was upon a man, and then he was the storm. Merritt manned the relay, passing instructions, redirecting fighters, keeping the chain of command alive. And still, they were pushed back. The enemy had numbers. They had ammunition. They had no soul. but they did not have Isaac, because Isaac had been sent away. Hours before the standoff, Barrow had taken him through the southern tunnel, bundled in furs and hidden in a supply cart. 2 women from the border town rode with him, women no one would think twice about, who could pass as traders or traveling healers. They were to take him to the Lakota stronghold 4 days south. If anything happened to the valley, the chief said, at least the bloodline would live. But Isaac had fought them, had cried, had bitten and kicked Dot until one of the women, gentle, older, whispered in his ear, "You are the seed. They fear you because they know what grows from truth." And he had stilled Dot in the valley. The defenders broke through a wave, only to be met with 2 more. Barrow was wounded. Rook lost sight in one eye from shrapnel. The chief fell and rose and fell again, pulled from the fray by those still breathing. It was Annie who took the final stand. They breached the last barricade just before dawn. She met them at the chapel's door, gun in hand, and behind her, nothing but firelight and the hollow echo of an empty cradle. The woman in charge stepped forward. The same voice as before. "You hit him." Annie didn't answer. "You think this will save you?" "We're already saved," Annie said. The woman raised her hand, and then a shot rang out, not from the enemy, but from the ridge. Merritt had lit the flare. And from the hills came a roar. Lakota. Riders, dozens, followed by settlers from the west. Black farmers. Freedmen militias. Tribes who had once stayed. Neutral. They descended like thunder, and the enemy broke. Scattered. Fell. Some surrendered. Most ran. By sunrise, the valley was littered with smoke and bodies and blood and song. Annie dropped to her knees, and behind her, Isaac toddled into view, carried by the woman who had taken him south, but had turned back at the first sign of fire in the sky. He reached for Annie, and she wept. The chief was carried out. Broken but alive, Barrow leaned on a crutch. Rook knelt at Merritt's side, her arm fractured, but her pencil still in her grip. They had survived, not by chance, but by choice, by love. By defiance, by the blood that was never theirs to erase. The valley did not go quiet. Quiet was for the dead, and they were not dead, not all of them. The air still trembled with smoke and grief and the shudder of men trying not to cry where others could see. It took 2 days to gather the bodies, 3 to dig the graves. They ran out of shovels. Some dug with bare hands. Some didn't stop digging even when their fingers bled. Isaac sat on Annie's hip the whole time, watching. Always watching. The child didn't speak much, not then. But his eyes moved like he remembered every face, every fall. The survivors came to call him the boy who bore witness, and none dared speak ill of him again. Not in that valley. Not in that part of the world. The Lakota riders stayed for a week. They helped with the wounded, rebuilt what they could, hunted fresh meat. They didn't speak often, but when they did, it was always with purpose. The chief of their band was a man called Toke. He spoke little English, but when he looked at Isaac, he muttered a word that even Annie understood. Viaka. Feather. Light, but carried by the wind. After the funerals, Toke asked to speak with the chief. Annie stood nearby with Isaac, her shoulders square, eyes sharp. "He is not just yours," Toke said, nodding at the child. "He belongs to many. We have stories, old ones, about a child with sun-dark skin and a soul born from sorrow. One who would carry fire in his chest and water in his hands." Balance. The chief didn't interrupt. He understood the weight of prophecy. He had carried it once, long ago. Toke continued. "We have elders who would guide him, teach him, but the world will not. When he is ready, he can return. But he must know who he is, not only through you." Annie didn't reply right away. She looked at Isaac, who was watching the firelight flicker on the grave markers. She thought about the weight he already bore, the burden of being born both loved and hated in a land that hadn't yet decided what to do with children like him. She crouched down, met his eyes. "Do you want to go with them, Isaac?" He didn't answer with words. He just looked up at Toke, then reached out and touched the beadwork on the man's belt. It was answer enough. They agreed on a plan. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. Until then, the valley became a living thing again, a place remade in fire and resilience. Merritt stayed, set up a proper press in the North Barn. Her writings spread. People came from far, farmers, widows, orphans, a few soldiers with medals they no longer wanted. They didn't call it a commune. That word was too soft. It became a sanctuary, a last stand, a first chance. Barrow taught the newcomers to build. Rook ran defense drills every dawn. The chief planted trees for every name carved into the chapel wall. Annie taught Isaac how to read. He liked stories with fire in them, with heroes who weren't perfect and monsters that looked like men. When he laughed, he looked like Suna. When he frowned, he looked like someone Annie had never met, a man who must have passed his blood down from centuries before, who had survived worse and still sired beauty. One evening, months later, Annie found a letter on her doorstep. No address, no signature. Just one line. "He's safer than he should be. I reckon you gave him something I couldn't." She folded the paper, pressed it to her heart. Barrow. He hadn't said goodbye. Just vanished one morning, after sharpening all the knives and fixing the north gate hinge. No one blamed him. Some people stay, some people save. Some people don't know how to do both. In the summer, a storm broke the western wall. It didn't matter. The valley rebuilt in hours, not days. They knew how now. And one day, not long after Isaac turned 5, Toke returned. No drums. No speeches. Just a soft knock on the chapel door. Annie opened it. "Is it time?" she asked. Toke nodded. Isaac was already packed. He had chosen his own bag, brought one book, one stone from the river, and one photo, a drawing Merritt had made of Annie holding him the day after the attack. He gave her the stone before he left. "To remember I come back," he said. She didn't cry until he was out of sight, but she did cry. That night, the chief sat beside her on the porch, said nothing for a long time. Finally, he asked, "Do you think the world is better now?" Annie didn't answer right away. She listened to the wind. To the rustling trees. To the sound of children laughing in the meadow. "No," she said, "but I think we are." Years passed. Isaac came and went. When he returned at 12, he wore ceremonial paint and walked with bare feet. At 16, he spoke 3 languages and built a school in the East Field. At 21, he took over the chief's duties when the old man's breath began to falter. When Annie grew ill, he sat beside her every day, read to her, held her hand. She passed in her sleep, and when they buried her, he placed the river stone on her chest. The people asked what to call the valley now. He said, "Call it Suna." They did. And no one forgot why.